Marcus stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a chessboard of ambitions and failures. 3 years ago, he had been the eager junior analyst who believed hard work and honesty would inevitably lead to success. That version of himself had been systematically dismantled by a series of corporate betrayals, backstabbing colleagues, and ruthless superiors who saw his naivety as weakness to be exploited. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It began with a single moment of clarity when he realized that the rules he had been following were not the rules by which the game was actually played. While he worked late nights preparing honest reports, his colleagues were building networks, making strategic alliances, and positioning themselves for advancement through carefully calculated moves that had nothing to do with merit. The first principle of Machiavellian thinking emerged from this realization: the world operates on power dynamics, not fairness. Every interaction, every relationship, every decision exists within a complex web of competing interests where the strongest and most strategically minded individuals rise to the top. This is neither good nor evil, it simply is. Understanding this fundamental truth requires abandoning several comfortable illusions that most people carry throughout their lives. The first illusion is that good intentions and hard work are sufficient for success. While these qualities may be necessary, they are far from sufficient in environments where others operate according to more sophisticated strategic principles. The second illusion is that people generally act from pure motives. Machiavellian thinking recognizes that every human action serves multiple purposes, often unconsciously. The colleague who offers help may genuinely care about your success, but they are also positioning themselves to be seen as helpful, creating an obligation, or gathering information about your projects. This doesn't make them evil, it makes them human. The third illusion is that being liked is more important than being respected. Machiavellian thinkers understand that respect, not affection, is the foundation of sustainable power. A leader who is feared and respected will outlast one who is merely liked but not taken seriously when difficult decisions must be made. Marcus learned these lessons through a painful process of trial and error. His first attempt at strategic thinking backfired spectacularly when he tried to form an alliance with a senior manager by sharing negative information about a competitor. The manager immediately reported this conversation to Marcus's supervisor, positioning himself as trustworthy while simultaneously eliminating Marcus as a threat. The failure taught him a crucial lesson about information as currency. In any organization or social environment, information flows according to power structures and strategic interests. Those who control information flow control outcomes. But information shared carelessly becomes a weapon that can be turned against you. This principle extends far beyond corporate environments. In personal relationships, social circles, and family dynamics, the same patterns emerge. People unconsciously gather and distribute information in ways that serve their interests, protect their positions, and advance their goals. The Machiavellian thinker learns to recognize these patterns and navigate them skillfully. The development of strategic consciousness requires cultivating 3 essential capabilities: situational awareness, strategic patience, and emotional detachment. Situational awareness means constantly analyzing the true power dynamics in any environment, identifying the real decision-makers, understanding the hidden motivations driving various parties, and recognizing opportunities for advancement or threats to be avoided. Strategic patience involves resisting the impulse for immediate gratification or reaction in favor of long-term positioning. When Marcus's colleague took credit for his research, his first instinct was confrontation. Instead, he documented the incident carefully and waited for the right moment to reveal his colleague's pattern of plagiarism to someone who had the power and motivation to act on that information. Emotional detachment doesn't mean becoming cold or uncaring, but rather maintaining the ability to analyze situations objectively without being overwhelmed by personal feelings. Marcus learned to separate his emotional responses from his strategic assessments, allowing him to make decisions based on likely outcomes rather than immediate emotional satisfaction. The foundation of Machiavellian thinking also requires understanding the concept of frame control. In any interaction or situation, someone's interpretation of reality becomes the dominant framework through which events are understood and decisions are made. The person who controls the frame controls the outcome. Frame control operates through language, presentation, and strategic positioning. When Marcus was passed over for promotion, he could have accepted the frame that he simply wasn't qualified or ready. Instead, he carefully researched the decision-making process and discovered that the promotion had gone to someone with stronger internal political connections but fewer relevant qualifications. Rather than complaining about unfairness, Marcus shifted the frame by positioning himself as someone who understood that advanced qualifications meant he should be considered for more challenging roles. He began seeking assignments that would showcase his capabilities while building the political connections he had previously neglected. This reframing transformed his narrative from passed-over employee to high-potential individual being positioned for greater responsibilities. The change in frame led to substantively different treatment from superiors who began seeing him as someone worth investing in rather than someone who had been rightfully overlooked. The development of strategic consciousness also requires understanding the difference between tactics and strategy. Tactics are specific actions taken to achieve immediate goals, while strategy is the overarching approach that guides tactical decisions toward long-term objectives. Many people who attempt to adopt Machiavellian thinking focus exclusively on tactics, manipulation techniques, persuasion methods, or power plays without developing the strategic framework that makes these tactics effective. This approach typically backfires because tactical maneuvers without strategic coherence appear random, desperate, or transparently manipulative. True Machiavellian thinking develops strategy first, then selects tactics that serve strategic objectives while maintaining plausible deniability and moral acceptability. The strategy provides the framework for deciding which battles to fight, which alliances to form, which risks to take, and which opportunities to pursue. Marcus's strategic framework evolved to include three primary objectives: building genuine expertise that created value for others, developing a network of mutually beneficial relationships, and positioning himself as indispensable to key decision-makers. Every tactical decision was evaluated against these strategic objectives. When offered the chance to take credit for a popular but ultimately unsuccessful project, Marcus declined because failure would damage his reputation for competence. When invited to join gossip sessions about company leadership, he participated enough to gather information but avoided contributing content that could be traced back to him if relationships shifted. The strategic framework also helped him recognize when apparent opportunities were actually traps. A rival offered to recommend him for a high-visibility assignment that required working with a notoriously difficult client. Instead of jumping at the chance for visibility, Marcus researched the client relationship and discovered that the previous 3 people assigned to that account had been transferred or terminated after the client complained about their performance. Understanding that this was likely an attempt to set him up for failure, Marcus respectfully declined while suggesting an alternative candidate who had been spreading rumors about his competence. The rival's recommendation resulted in that candidate's removal from contention for future promotions, while Marcus avoided a career-damaging assignment. This level of strategic thinking requires developing what might be called systemic vision, the ability to see beyond immediate cause and effect relationships to understand how various forces interact across time and organizational levels. Most people think in terms of linear causation: action leads to reaction. Machiavellian thinkers understand that every action creates ripple effects that interact with other forces to produce outcomes that may be quite different from what was originally intended. The foundation of strategic consciousness ultimately rests on accepting personal responsibility for outcomes while refusing to accept other people's framing of what those outcomes should be. Marcus learned to define success according to his own strategic objectives rather than allowing others to impose their definitions on his situation. This shift in perspective transformed his relationship with failure and setback. Instead of viewing these experiences as evidence of personal inadequacy, he began analyzing them as information about the strategic environment and opportunities for tactical adjustment. Each setback became a lesson in understanding power dynamics, reading people's motivations, and positioning himself more effectively. The development of this mindset requires constant vigilance against the human tendency to retreat into comfortable illusions when reality becomes challenging. It requires accepting that most social and professional environments operate according to unspoken rules that favor those who understand power dynamics over those who focus exclusively on formal procedures or moral principles. This doesn't require abandoning moral principles, but rather understanding how to advance those principles effectively within systems that operate according to different logic. The alternative, maintaining moral purity while remaining powerless, ultimately serves no one and changes nothing. As Marcus looked out at the city, he reflected on how his perspective had evolved. He no longer saw the urban landscape as a collection of buildings but as a complex system of competing interests, strategic alliances, and power relationships. Each light in each window represented someone making decisions that would ripple through networks of influence to create outcomes that would advantage some and disadvantage others. Understanding this reality didn't make him cynical, it made him effective. He had learned to navigate these systems skillfully while maintaining his core values and building genuine value for others. The weak self that had been repeatedly victimized by stronger strategic thinkers had been replaced by someone who understood the rules of the game and played them better than most. The art of strategic deception and emotional intelligence. The mastery of Machiavellian thinking requires understanding that truth, while valuable, is not always strategically optimal to reveal in its complete form. This principle troubled Sarah initially, as she had been raised to believe that honesty was always the best policy. Her transformation began during her first year as a project manager when she learned that absolute transparency could be weaponized against her by those who selectively shared information to serve their own interests. The concept of strategic deception doesn't involve outright lying or fraud, but rather the skillful management of information flow, timing, and framing to achieve optimal outcomes. It requires developing sophisticated emotional intelligence combined with the analytical capability to assess how different pieces of information will be received, interpreted, and used by various parties. Sarah's education in this principle began when she discovered that her predecessor had been terminated not for incompetence, but for being too forthright about budget overruns and timeline challenges in a project that had significant political importance to senior leadership. Her transparency had been appreciated in principle but punished in practice because it created complications for executives who had made public commitments based on optimistic projections. Understanding this dynamic required recognizing that people often ask for information they don't actually want to receive, or want to receive in forms that allow them to maintain plausible deniability if outcomes prove unfavorable. The art lies in providing information in ways that serve everyone's strategic interests while maintaining technical accuracy. When Sarah inherited a project with serious budget concerns, she faced the same dilemma that had destroyed her predecessor. Instead of announcing the problems directly, she developed a presentation that highlighted several scenarios with different resource allocation options. The most realistic scenario required additional funding, but it was presented as one option among several, allowing leadership to choose increased investment as their decision rather than having problems imposed upon them. This approach demonstrated several key principles of strategic information management. First, the presentation of options rather than problems preserves the decision-maker's sense of agency and control. Second, embedding necessary truths within broader context reduces their psychological impact while ensuring they cannot be ignored. Third, providing multiple scenarios allows leaders to select the narrative that best serves their needs while ensuring that realistic assessments are part of the official record. The emotional intelligence component of this approach required Sarah to understand how different personalities and organizational positions would respond to various framings of the same information. Her direct supervisor appreciated detailed analysis and worst-case planning, so private conversations with him included frank assessments of risks and challenges. The executive sponsor preferred high-level summaries focused on strategic implications, so communications with her emphasized business impact rather than technical details. This tailored approach to information sharing required developing sophisticated models of how different people processed information, made decisions, and responded to various types of pressure. Sarah learned to identify whether someone was primarily motivated by risk avoidance, opportunity maximization, public recognition, or problem-solving satisfaction. Each motivation type required different communication strategies to achieve optimal results. The development of emotional intelligence within a Machiavellian framework also involves understanding the difference between emotional manipulation and emotional leadership. Manipulation involves creating false emotional states to extract compliance or advantage. Emotional leadership involves understanding and working with authentic emotional dynamics to achieve mutually beneficial outcomes. Sarah discovered this distinction when dealing with a team member who consistently missed deadlines and provided excuses rather than solutions. Her initial impulse was to address the performance issues directly through formal procedures. However, spending time understanding the individual's perspective revealed that he felt overwhelmed by technical challenges he was embarrassed to admit and was compensating through overcommitment and avoidance. Rather than pursuing disciplinary action, Sarah reframed his situation as an opportunity to develop expertise in emerging technologies that would benefit his career development. She arranged for training and mentorship while redistributing some of his workload to prevent immediate project impact. This approach addressed the performance issues while maintaining team morale and actually improved his long-term value to the organization. The strategic deception involved in this situation was allowing the team member to save face by framing skill development as advancement opportunity rather than remedial action. The outcome served everyone's interests, the project stayed on track, the individual improved his capabilities, and Sarah demonstrated leadership effectiveness that enhanced her reputation with both subordinates and supervisors. This level of emotional intelligence requires developing what might be called empathetic analysis, the ability to understand other people's perspectives, motivations, and emotional states without necessarily sharing or being controlled by those emotions. It involves maintaining sufficient emotional distance to analyze interpersonal dynamics objectively while demonstrating sufficient emotional connection to build trust and influence. The practice of empathetic analysis begins with careful observation of how people respond to different situations, what triggers their defensive reactions, what motivates their best performance, and what communication styles resonate with their personality types. Sarah learned to identify pattern recognition in human behavior that allowed her to predict how individuals would respond to various approaches. One of her most challenging situations involved managing a project that required cooperation between two department heads who had a long history of territorial disputes. Rather than trying to resolve their underlying conflict, Sarah analyzed their motivations and designed a project structure that allowed each to achieve their primary objectives while requiring minimal direct collaboration. She scheduled separate briefing sessions where each department head could present their expertise and concerns without direct confrontation. The project timeline was structured so that their teams worked sequentially rather than simultaneously, reducing opportunities for territorial disputes. Most importantly, the final presentation highlighted each department's contributions distinctly, ensuring both received appropriate recognition. This approach required strategic deception in the sense that neither department head fully understood how the project structure was designed to manage their relationship. They each believed the structure reflected recognition of their importance and expertise, when it actually reflected Sarah's analysis of how to work around their inability to collaborate effectively. The emotional intelligence required for this type of strategic management also involves understanding how to build and maintain multiple types of relationships simultaneously. Sarah learned to cultivate different aspects of her personality for different professional relationships while maintaining authenticity and consistency in her core values and commitments. With senior leadership, she emphasized strategic thinking, results orientation, and reliability. With peers, she focused on collaboration, mutual support, and shared problem-solving. With subordinates, she highlighted mentorship, fairness, and recognition for contributions. Each relationship dynamic required different communication styles, different types of information sharing, and different approaches to building trust and influence. This multifaceted approach to relationship management often meant having conversations about the same project or situation that emphasized different aspects depending on the audience's interests and concerns. When discussing budget challenges with finance leadership, she focused on cost control measures and efficiency improvements. When discussing the same challenges with project team members, she emphasized resource optimization and process improvements that would make their work more manageable. The strategic deception involved ensuring that each audience received information framed in ways that served their needs and interests while maintaining overall consistency in facts and objectives. This required sophisticated understanding of how different organizational perspectives and priorities created different frameworks for interpreting the same underlying reality. Sarah also learned that effective strategic deception requires understanding the difference between concealment and misdirection. Concealment involves withholding information that could be damaging if revealed prematurely or inappropriately. Misdirection involves drawing attention towards certain aspects of a situation while allowing other aspects to remain in the background. When her project faced a potential delay due to vendor performance issues, Sarah needed to manage communications to prevent panic while maintaining credibility. Concealment would have involved hiding the vendor problems entirely, which would have damaged trust if discovered and prevented appropriate preparation for potential delays. Instead, she used misdirection by focusing attention on proactive measures being taken to ensure project success, alternative vendor evaluations, process improvements, and contingency planning. The vendor problems were mentioned as part of the comprehensive risk management approach, but attention was directed toward solutions rather than problems. This approach maintained transparency about challenges while framing them within a context that emphasized competent leadership and proactive problem solving. It allowed stakeholders to understand the situation without creating unnecessary anxiety or undermining confidence in project management. The mastery of strategic deception also requires understanding how to manage one's own emotional responses and public persona to support strategic objectives. Sarah learned that her immediate emotional reactions to frustrating situations, while understandable, often provided information to others that could be used against her strategic interests. When a colleague took credit for her analysis during a high-visibility presentation, her initial anger was entirely justified but strategically counterproductive. Expressing that anger publicly would have made her appear petty and focused on personal recognition rather than project success. Instead, she channeled her emotional energy into documentation and strategic positioning for future opportunities. She began keeping detailed records of her contributions and insights, sharing them with appropriate stakeholders through seemingly casual conversations and follow-up communications. She positioned herself as someone who was generous with credit but meticulous about accuracy and accountability. When patterns of credit-taking became evident to others, her reputation for competence and integrity made the colleague's behavior appear obviously inappropriate. This approach demonstrated how emotional intelligence can be combined with strategic patience to achieve better outcomes than immediate emotional satisfaction. The colleague's behavior ultimately damaged his own reputation while Sarah's measured response enhanced hers. The development of sophisticated emotional intelligence within a Machiavellian framework also requires understanding how to read the emotional and political dynamics of groups rather than just individuals. Sarah learned to identify alliance structures, influence patterns, and communication networks that determined how decisions actually got made in her organization. She discovered that formal organizational charts rarely reflected actual power relationships. Influence often flowed through informal networks based on personal relationships, shared experiences, and mutual dependencies. Understanding these networks required careful observation of who communicated with whom, whose opinions carried weight in different types of decisions, and how information and support moved through the organization. This network analysis allowed her to identify key influencers who could help advance her projects and career objectives. Rather than trying to build relationships with everyone, she focused on cultivating connections with individuals who had demonstrated influence over the types of decisions that mattered to her strategic goals. The strategic deception involved in this approach was allowing these key influencers to believe their support was being sought because of their expertise or judgment, when it was actually being sought because of their influence and strategic position. The outcome was mutually beneficial. They received recognition and consultation that enhanced their status, while she gained access to informal power networks that improved her effectiveness. As Sarah reflected on her development, she realized that the combination of strategic deception and emotional intelligence had transformed her from someone who was constantly surprised by organizational politics into someone who could navigate and influence those politics effectively. She had learned to see beyond the surface level of interpersonal interactions to understand the deeper currents of motivation, power, and strategic interest that drove human behavior in complex organizational environments. The metamorphosis of power and self-mastery. The final stage of Machiavellian mastery requires transcending the tactical and strategic levels to achieve what might be called existential sovereignty, the ability to define oneself independent of external validation while exercising influence that appears natural rather than manipulative. This transformation represents the difference between someone who uses Machiavellian techniques and someone who embodies Machiavellian principles at a fundamental level. David's journey to this level began with recognizing that his previous approaches to power and influence, while effective, required constant effort and vigilance that ultimately limited his effectiveness. He had mastered the techniques of strategic thinking and emotional intelligence, but found himself trapped in reactive patterns where he was constantly maneuvering in response to other people's actions and organizational dynamics. The breakthrough came when he realized that true power comes not from controlling specific outcomes, but from creating conditions where favorable outcomes become inevitable. This shift in perspective required developing what might be called systemic influence, the ability to shape the environments and frameworks within which decisions get made rather than trying to influence specific decisions directly. David began studying how the most influential people in his industry operated, and discovered that they rarely engaged in obvious power struggles or political maneuvering. Instead, they positioned themselves as indispensable resources, created value that others couldn't easily replicate, and built networks that function more like ecosystems than traditional hierarchical relationships. This approach required a fundamental redefinition of strength and weakness. Traditional thinking views strength as the ability to impose one's will despite resistance, and weakness as susceptibility to others' influence or manipulation. Machiavellian mastery recognizes that this definition creates unnecessary conflict and limits long-term effectiveness. True strength lies in making resistance unnecessary by aligning one's objectives with others' interests, and making one's success contribute to others' success. This doesn't require abandoning personal ambitions or strategic thinking, but rather developing the sophistication to pursue personal objectives through methods that create value for others rather than taking value from them. David's transformation began with analyzing his own patterns of thought and reaction to identify areas where his ego, insecurities, or emotional attachments created strategic vulnerabilities. He discovered that his need for recognition often led him to seek credit in ways that created unnecessary conflict with colleagues. His discomfort with ambiguity caused him to seek clarity and resolution in situations where strategic advantage lay in maintaining flexibility. Most significantly, his identification with specific roles and positions made him vulnerable to threats against those external markers of success. As long as his sense of self-worth depended on title, salary, or organizational status, he remained vulnerable to anyone who could threaten those things. Achieving true power required developing an identity based on internal capabilities and values rather than external validation. This process of inner transformation wasn't merely psychological self-improvement, it was strategic necessity. People who operate from positions of inner security and confidence naturally attract others and inspire trust in ways that cannot be faked through technique alone. Conversely, people who are driven by insecurity or validation needs unconsciously communicate those needs to others, creating opportunities for manipulation and undermining their influence. David began practicing what he came to think of as strategic detachment, maintaining emotional and psychological distance from specific outcomes while remaining fully committed to the process of achieving those outcomes. This paradoxical state allowed him to pursue goals with maximum effectiveness while avoiding the desperation or attachment that undermines strategic thinking. The practice of strategic detachment began with small-scale exercises in daily interactions. When presenting ideas in meetings, instead of becoming invested in whether his specific suggestions were adopted, David focused on whether the conversation moved toward productive outcomes. If someone else's approach proved superior, he supported it genuinely rather than defending his original position. This shift in behavior had immediate effects on group dynamics. Colleagues began viewing him as someone who was genuinely interested in finding the best solutions rather than promoting his own ideas. This reputation made people more receptive to his suggestions and more likely to seek his input on important decisions. The deeper transformation involved reconceptualizing conflict and competition. Traditional thinking views these as zero-sum situations where one person's gain requires another's loss. Machiavellian mastery seeks to transform apparent zero-sum situations into positive-sum outcomes where everyone's strategic interests can be served simultaneously. David encountered this principle when two departments were competing for limited resources for their respective projects. Rather than choosing sides or trying to mediate between their competing claims, he analyzed the underlying objectives both departments were trying to achieve and developed a proposal that addressed those objectives through a combined approach that would require fewer total resources than either department's individual plan. The proposal required each department to modify their original vision, but offered both departments opportunities to achieve their core objectives while demonstrating innovation and collaboration rather than territorial competition. The success of the combined project enhanced both departments' reputations and established David as someone who could create value through strategic thinking rather than political maneuvering. This approach to conflict transformation requires understanding what might be called meta-level thinking, the ability to step outside immediate competitive dynamics to identify higher-order frameworks where apparent conflicts can be resolved through redefinition rather than confrontation. It requires asking not just how can I win this competition, but how can this situation be restructured so that competition becomes unnecessary. The development of meta-level thinking also applies to personal interactions and relationship dynamics. David learned to recognize when interpersonal conflicts were actually symptoms of deeper structural issues rather than genuine disagreements between individuals. Instead of addressing conflicts at the personal level, he began addressing the structural conditions that created those conflicts. When team meetings consistently devolved into unproductive arguments, instead of trying to manage the personalities involved, David analyzed the meeting structure and discovered that the agenda format was creating competitive rather than collaborative dynamics. People were presenting individual updates that implicitly competed for time and attention rather than working together on shared challenges. He redesigned the meeting format to focus on collective problem-solving around specific challenges, with individual contributions framed as resources for addressing shared objectives rather than separate reports. This structural change eliminated most of the interpersonal conflict without requiring anyone to change their personality or communication style. This experience taught him that many situations that appear to require interpersonal skill or political maneuvering can actually be resolved more effectively through systematic analysis and structural innovation. The most elegant solutions often make tactical maneuvering unnecessary by changing the conditions within which people operate. The mastery of this approach requires developing what might be called architectural thinking, the ability to design systems, processes, and structures that naturally promote desired behaviors and outcomes. Instead of constantly managing people's actions and reactions, architectural thinking creates environments where people naturally act in ways that serve both their interests and broader objectives. David applied this principle when tasked with improving performance across multiple teams that had different working styles, priorities, and organizational cultures. Instead of implementing uniform procedures or conducting training sessions on collaboration, he designed a project structure that required teams to contribute their distinctive capabilities to shared deliverables. Each team's success depended on other teams' contributions, but each team could succeed by doing what they already did best rather than learning new methods. The structure created natural incentives for cooperation and mutual support while allowing each team to maintain their distinctive identity and approach. The success of this approach established David's reputation as someone who could solve complex organizational challenges through innovation rather than enforcement. This reputation became a form of power that operated independently of his formal position or authority. People began seeking his perspective on strategic challenges because his thinking consistently produced results that served everyone's interests. This transformation represented the achievement of what might be called gravitational influence, a form of power that attracts others naturally rather than requiring conscious effort to maintain. Like gravity, this influence operates continuously and affects everything within its range, but doesn't require constant energy expenditure from the person exercising it. Gravitational influence develops through consistent demonstration of value creation, strategic insight, and alignment between personal success and others' success. It requires genuine competence and integrity, because any attempt to fake these qualities will eventually be exposed and will undermine the foundation of natural influence. The maintenance of gravitational influence also requires what David came to think of as strategic invisibility, the ability to shape outcomes without drawing attention to the mechanics of that influence. People who are obviously manipulative or politically motivated trigger defensive reactions that limit their effectiveness, even when their tactics work in the short term. Strategic invisibility means allowing others to take credit for successes that result from your influence, while ensuring that your role in creating value becomes evident through patterns over time rather than explicit self-promotion. It means shaping conversations and decisions through questions and suggestions rather than directives, and creating conditions where others naturally reach conclusions that align with your strategic objectives. This approach requires extraordinary confidence and patience, because the person exercising strategic invisibility must often watch others receive immediate recognition for achievements that depended heavily on their behind-the-scenes contributions. However, the long-term result is sustainable influence that grows stronger over time rather than requiring constant maintenance and defense. David's mastery of these principles ultimately led to what he recognized as a fundamental transformation in his relationship with power itself. He no longer experienced power as something external that had to be acquired and defended, but as something internal that could be expressed through competence, strategic thinking, and value creation. This transformation eliminated most of the anxiety and effort that had characterized his earlier approaches to career advancement and organizational influence. Instead of constantly maneuvering for advantage or defending against threats, he focused on developing capabilities and creating value in ways that naturally attracted opportunities and support. The weak self that had once been vulnerable to others' manipulation or organizational politics had been replaced by someone whose sense of identity and worth was based on internal development rather than external validation. This inner security became the foundation for external influence that appeared effortless because it was based on genuine capability rather than tactical maneuvering. As David reflected on his transformation, he realized that the ultimate Machiavellian insight was that the most sustainable power comes not from defeating others, but from making oneself indispensable to others' success. The man who destroys his weak self, the part that needs external validation, fears others' success, or defines strength through domination, becomes truly indestructible because his power source is internal and his influence operates through value creation rather than value extraction. This realization represented the completion of his Machiavellian education. He had learned not just how to navigate power dynamics effectively, but how to transcend them by creating conditions where traditional power struggles became unnecessary. He had become someone who exercised influence through contribution rather than manipulation, and achieved security through competence rather than control. The principles that had once seemed dark and cynical had ultimately led to a way of operating in the world that was more ethical, more sustainable, and more effective than the naive approaches he had abandoned. The mastery of Machiavellian thinking had not corrupted his character, it had revealed how character, properly developed and strategically applied, becomes the most reliable source of lasting influence and success. In the end, the greatest victory is not over others, but over the parts of oneself that make defeat possible. The man who achieves this inner victory finds that external victories follow naturally, not through conquest but through the irresistible force of competence combined with character. This is the true mastery of Machiavellian thinking, not the manipulation of others, but the complete development of oneself.